war continued. Then we discovered that, unbelievably, at a UN position about a mile from Karna, run by the UN's Force Mobile Reserve, which is made up of all the nations who are involved in the peacekeeping force, which means Irish, Norwegian, French, Finnish, Ghanaian, Polish, that a young Norwegian soldier there, as the shelling began, pulled out his amateur video camera and started taking pictures, movie videotape. And the rumour went round that on this tape he got the drone as the shells fell on Karna. Again, let us go back to the day of Karna. As we're driving into the base, we can see the shelling, and Commandant Smith actually calls up the Fijians and said, "Is that you under shell fire? Are you still under shell fire?" And they said, "Roger, Roger." And then he goes back to Nakuru again and says, "UNIFIL headquarters, Fijian headquarters is still under shelling. Repeat, it's still under shelling." Very important little bit, because this was said, as we later found out, while the drone was overhead. Anyway, as the days followed, we heard about this film. Then we were told, I was told by one soldier, that he didn't know even if the drone was caught on the film or not, and if it wasn't there, then it was just a film of shelling. Then I was told, I went along to the burial after the ceasefire, the burial of the 109, as we now believe it was, victims, of whom 55 were children. Mass grave, and they're buried just beside the camp where they died. They're buried within feet of the place of their death. And many of the young Fijian troops there were crying, because they knew them. I mean, some of the soldiers, in the evenings when they thought Karna was safe, these refugees had been there several days, the Fijian soldiers were, taking the babies from their mothers and rocking them and putting them to sleep, and then they had to pick up these same babies in pieces. So for many of these soldiers, they were very, very upset, deeply, deeply shocked at what had happened. And one of them came up to me and he said, "Mr. Robert, I think there was a film, but I don't know if the drone was on it." Then I learned that the Norwegian soldiers had been told to give the film to the UN investigator, General von Kappen, that it had been taken to New York, and that they were not to talk about it or reveal anything about it. I was also told that the contents of the film would never be made public, and that Boutros Ghali was under great pressure from the Americans not to publish the UN investigation. And I was, as a journalist, pretty depressed at this, because I was after this film. I wanted it. I don't like technology, but I wanted this videotape. And one day, I think it was 2 or 3 days later, I was sitting at home in Beirut, and my wife was working in the sitting room, and I was working in my office, and my mobile phone went. And the voice of a UN soldier I had met came on the phone, and he gave a map reference and said 1300 hours and hung up. And I pulled out the map and went, it was a crossroads near Karna, and I've never driven to southern Lebanon so fast in all my life. And I was there at 1300 hours, and I sat in the car and waited in the heat. And in the mirror I saw a white UN Jeep pull up behind me. And out of it climbed a UN soldier in battle dress and blue beret. He will have to remain anonymous. And he walked up to me and he said, "Mr. Robert," I had met this person before. He said, "Mr. Robert, I saw the film and I copied it. The drone is on the film." He said that he had 2 children at home of his own, the same age as the children he carried dead in his arms at Karna. And he pulled the videotape out of his battle dress pocket and threw it onto the passenger seat of my car and said, "This is for them." And I thought to myself, I've never seen a soldier take such a brave decision. Big powers.
Only Boutros Ghali.
Yes. Well, wait.
Counted on.
Big powers can still try to cover up, but little men can still sometimes win. I took the video back to Beirut and I played it, and you saw the shells falling on Karna, and it was a very amateur film, very, very amateur, totally uncut. At one point, a Norwegian soldier puts his head in front of the camera, apparently not realizing, makes a silly face. You hear soldiers laughing and chatting, and then you hear the radios going, and then you see these shells coming in.
Let's watch it.
Okay. Sure.
I'm Mark Brzezinski. This is Mideast Realities. Our guest is Robert Fisk, and I understand this is the first time that on American television this film is going to be shown.
Ever in its full and uncut state. This is the first time ever in the United States. Yes, that's true.
Thank you very much for giving us that opportunity, and just hearing you describe what took place there, it's chilling to sit with you and hear you describe it. I can't imagine.
It is not as chilling as to be there. That I promise.
I can't imagine what you described in person. So we'll watch the tape, and maybe you can narrate anything that's
I'll talk you through it
as we.
I think you should listen to part of it. Listen to these shells, for example. Now that's Kana where the smoke's coming from. That's the UN base. Now these are real shells. This is not Hollywood. These are proximity shells. There's another one. They're bursting approximately 9 meters off the ground. They're intended to give amputation wounds. That is their purpose in military.
Just what they did.
Yeah, and that's what they did. You can just see that puff of grey smoke above there. That's a proximity shell that's burst above the ground.
Right.
There's another one. All this film being taken. You see the bit of barbed wire closest to the camera?
Yes.
That's the perimeter of the Force Mobile Reserve position from which the Norwegian soldier is taking this film. Quite a windy day. You hear the wind going across the mic there. Very amateur videotape. But of course historic now, and tragic in every sense of the word. You have to remember here that lots of soldiers at this base are watching this.
The shelling went on for 12 minutes.
There were 17 minutes.
17
minutes, yeah.
With a pattern of firing. I'm not a military person, but one
They
of the
fell
giveaways
regularly.
is...
They fell regularly throughout it, yeah. As you can hear, here are some Norwegian troops who are watching. Again, you can see in the background Kana, and on the right, actually, another puff of smoke where a civilian house was hit outside the base. You see, interestingly enough, these soldiers are standing out in the open. They're not worried they're going to be hit. They don't assume these are stray rounds or they'd be in the bunker. That's a very important point.
Right.
And they're standing, look, up in the most exposed position, just watching this, assuming that it's what's meant to happen because they're not worried about their lives. Norwegians are beginning to talk about it now. Now there you see on the left that big cloud of smoke that's gathering. That's all the Israeli shells over Kano. There goes another shell over. The shells are being fired from the left of the screen here, and of course they're not going across. They're coming down on top. They're fired at a high trajectory and coming right down from on top. Very amateur film again, but you can see the degree of. There's another. You can see where another proximity shell has burst above. That grey smoke at the top that hangs in the sky. There's always a fool on the videotape. There's the guy making the face. Now you hear the Norwegian radio commentary coming on to UN headquarters, warning that something terrible is happening. They're beginning to realise that something awful is going on. That there are people who are exposed down there. They're not all in the bunkers. And still the shelling is continuing. Oh, there's another shell. They're speaking Norwegian. They're talking to each other about what must be happening in Kano. Very soon you'll hear the UN radio traffic headquarters talking. Now, quite soon from now, you'll begin to hear a thin, high tone on the film, and that is, in fact, the sound of a drone. And then a Norwegian soldier will appear and look up at it. Now, just listen for the next minute, and you'll begin to hear that sound of that drone, which is very important. The shelling is going on, and you hear the drone. There. That is the noise of the drone, and the shelling is continuing. It is over Kana as the shells fall. This soldier is going to look up at him. He's going to look up to the left, up high, and because he can hear the sound, and he's looking for the drone. And now, there's the sound. The shells fall on Kana, and the camera will move up, and you can see the drone just briefly. And there it is, taking photographs right in the middle of the screen. The Israelis also said they had no helicopters there. You heard the shell fall as we saw it. In fact, there was a helicopter watching the scene. You can see it coming up in just a moment. There's Kana still under fire. And you'll see a helicopter flying over, dropping phosphorus flares to mislead heat-seeking missiles that might be fired at it by the Hezbollah. There's one flare come down, and a second one. And in a moment it will drop a third flare, and there is the third flare. Made of phosphorus, and that's the helicopter over Kana. Now the camera moves back, and you will see the conference room. In the very centre of the screen, you can see the flicker of fire. That is the conference room in which up to 50 people are being cremated as you watch that video film. They're dying in there now. Now that's Commandant Smith's voice. Roger, Roger. And he says, you were with him.
3-4, Roger, out to you. Hello, Unifil, Unifil officer, Unifil 3-4, over. Unifil 3-4, you copy that, over.
Copy that. Did you read it? Say it again.
3-4, VG Bass headquarters is still under shelling. VG Bass headquarters is still under shelling.
Now that is Commandant Smith's voice, and I'm sitting next to him. He's just on the other side of that hill with me, and we're heading for Kana. And he's on passing their radio messages to the operations room at the United Nations. And now the Fijian officer goes on and speaks in his own language to a Fijian at headquarters to explain exactly what's going on. Still you hear the drone. You can hear it over the top. You can't see it now, you can hear it. Now we see Lebanese people trying to get the wounded to hospital, and we're in a UN vehicle heading up to the helicopter pad where they're going to try and evacuate some of the wounded. This is through the streets of Qana, in the back of an armoured vehicle going up to the helicopter pad where they're going to try and get the wounded out. Again, very amateur piece of film. You can hear the chopper in the background. In the ambulance you see in the foreground there is a wounded man. A lot of chaos. On the far right you can just see a Fijian UN soldier taking photographs for the record, for the historical record. In the middle, it'll become more visible in a moment, an Italian helicopter pilot, a NATO pilot, there he is, the camera, who's the pilot of the chopper behind us, so to speak, as we watch this, arranging for this passenger to be put on board the chopper, this wounded person. A lot of chaos. For example, here's a Norwegian nurse with a Fijian soldier trying to carry a stretcher, and in all the chaos, they actually drop the stretcher virtually, as you'll see now. Not the best way to look after wounded people, but fortunately there's nobody wounded on the stretcher. There's another wounded man being taken across to the helicopter, you can see in the background. And very shortly you'll actually see the helicopter on the landing pad with Fijian troops tending to the wounded round it. There's the chopper on the land. This is taken through the rear armoured window of a UN armoured vehicle. Now on the left you see wounded people lying on the ground and Fijian troops deciding which ones would get on the chopper. Many of the people being put on the chopper are dying. I think this picture speaks for itself. You can imagine the pain and terror that's going on among those people at the moment. This is a Fijian soldier, very badly wounded. He almost lost his leg. He's being put in the ambulance for transport down to the medical centre at UN headquarters at Nakura on the Lebanese-Israeli border. And the last scene you see on the tape in a moment is a wounded woman and her two wounded children being told there is no more room on the helicopter. They're standing with 3 Fijian soldiers beside the chopper, and you'll see them in a moment. And the helicopter is already overloaded with the wounded and the dying. And we'll move in on him here with the screen. The pilot has to get out of the helicopter again and order them to go away. He's coming down and says, go away, like he's saying with his arms. Move back, there's no more room, go away, go away. And the last scene as the camera moves in, this very amateur videotape, you see the wounded woman and her 2 little children being turned away. They cannot be evacuated. And that's where the tape ended.
I'm Mark Brzezinski. You're watching Mideast Realities, and you've just watched the first time that this remarkable videotape from a historic massacre. I think the name Qana now goes down in the history books with Deir Yassin, with a whole series of massacres that have taken place since 1948.
By all sides.
By all sides. But nevertheless, the magnitude of Israeli technology, the magnitude of Israeli attempts to cover up.
I think you should say as well the magnitude of American weaponry. Those shells were made in the United States, and the artillery that fired them were made in the United States. That is a very important point.
And the money and the political cover that makes it all possible, and that makes the cover-up all possible.
That's you talking. That's you talking. Look, I spent so long investigating this massacre that perhaps I'm being too finicky over facts, but I don't think so. I think it's very important to get every possible detail right, not least because the Israelis got them wrong. What was interesting is that after this videotape came out, what happened with me, by the way, I got the videotape and took it back to Beirut. I saw this, of course, for the first time, and this was within days of the massacre, so it was even more powerful then than it is now, almost exactly a year later, and the anniversary is in a few days of the massacre, first anniversary. And I duplicated it about 20 times. I sent copies to London by air. We brought all our editors in on the Sunday afternoon, because I got it on the Saturday. And we filled 3 pages of our paper. The front page with a strip of photographs that showed the drone, and 2 inside pages, pages 2 and 3. We just turned the paper over to this film. And then the UN said they had the film, and then they published the report. Now, I'm not saying they did it because we got our hands on this film, though I've been told that that's quite possible. What did happen afterwards, we gave the film to everybody who wanted to see it, including Israeli television. I actually carried a copy down to southern Lebanon and gave it to the UN to give to Israeli channels. And they did show the picture of the drone. After this all became public, the Israelis said that in their haste and their desire to help the United Nations at the time of the massacre, they had made a mistake. And indeed there had been a drone, but it was on another mission. And they didn't say what the other mission was, and I never found out what the other mission was. But I think at this point, journalism has to end and the facts of history take over.
Well, the facts of history are that Boutros Ghali watered the report down, but even after 4, I understand from people at the UN, there were 4 different watering downs of the report before
I
it was
know
released.
there was one watering down, but I don't know about the sequence of others. But I believe there is an original report which is much harsher than the one that came out, which concluded that it was probably not in error, which is a diplomatic way of saying they believe it was deliberate.
Our time's limited. We've only got a few more minutes. I want to go back to the peace process. You say it's dead. Mm-hmm. You say the death started at Oslo, although there was a carcass to stick something in at the time. But where are we going?
Let me just say this. I think it's important to say it. I don't think any journalist, even if he got it right, should take any satisfaction out of what happened, or even cynical laughter. I think that the results of what have happened, and this is what we're coming to, are going to be very grim. And I've just bought my first flak jacket for Lebanon, which shows you how seriously I take it. 14 kilos, $1,500, very heavy. I think very terrible days may lie ahead of us. Not just because...
Flush that out.
Well, I'll give you an example. I sat in a Palestinian camp in Lebanon a few days ago, and the Palestinians there were military people. They were taking phone calls from Gaza and the West Bank, and they were quite clearly ensuring that Palestinians who had fought in the Lebanon War and who knew how to do street fighting were in the towns and cities of the West Bank and Gaza, because they believe that the Israelis are going to try and go into those towns, that there will be violence, that maybe there'll be suicide bombings, and let us not disguise the wickedness and evil of killing innocent people, innocent Israelis, but that the Israelis will find a moment to go into some of those towns, and the Palestinians, I think in many cases, are ready to try and fight them. And this is not an intifada with stones and burning tires. I'll quote you what one Palestinian said to me in the Ain al-Helwi camp in Sidon, who is intimately involved in conversations over the telephone with the West Bank and Gaza. He said, Intifada 2 will not be stones and burning rubber tires. There must be a qualitative difference. There must be direct contact with the Israelis. And he's talking about a shooting war. The greatest fear of the Palestinians is that the West Bank could be overwhelmed and Gaza would be allowed to be isolated and starved and surrounded. I, like any sane person, would hope that none of this ever comes about. But clearly, a lot of people are talking about it, a lot of people are preparing for that eventuality, and it isn't difficult to see how, if this happened, the spillover into Lebanon, where the ceasefire committee that was set up following that massacre no longer exists because the Syrians no longer complain. There is therefore no further meetings between the French, Americans, Lebanese, Syrians and Israelis in the south of Lebanon, which means there's no more control on the fighting there. It's not difficult to see how a further shelling by the Israelis of a village might elicit the Hezbollah to fire Katyushas into Israel, so a second front would be opened. We can then see how the Israelis would feel that the Syrians were deliberately trying to foment war and corner them, that they might then feel they want to bomb the Syrian positions inside Lebanon, perhaps even inside Syria, and you can see then a quite different situation, a very, very grim perspective opening up. At the same time, it's also important to note, again, not reported in America, the degree of Arab hatred towards Israel now. It is a fact, for instance, unreported here, that 2 weeks ago 6,000 students from the Cairo University were prevented by Egyptian police with tear gas from marching on the Israeli embassy to protest at the new Jewish settlement. In Jordan, the lawyers syndicate, the lawyers union, has been flooded, overwhelmed with lawyers calling them, offering their services free to defend the soldier who murdered the 7 young Israeli schoolchildren. A Kuwaiti man has offered $9,000 to the family of the soldier because his pay has been stopped. That is not an environment in which people are looking for peace and thinking that things will go, quote, back on track, unquote. So you have a very, very grim perspective in front, and the worst thing about it is that the Americans cannot say, okay, we made a mistake, we weren't even-handed, let's start again. You can't do that. So there's nothing to fill the vacuum. That's why it's so dangerous.
Arab hatred of Israel or Arab hatred of Israel and America and the West?
Not of Europe, because particularly the European Union statements about 242, and especially President Chirac's visit to Jerusalem and Damascus and Lebanon, has given the Europeans credit. Not, I think, with much reason in reality.
A little bit of cover.
But well, we'd like to sell some more guns to the Gulf Arabs, of course. Yes, don't let us get carried away with that. But certainly, well, towards Israel, I don't think it really diminished very much. But the growing fury, the realization that America is not an honest broker, but is effectively part of the Israeli side, which it has become, means that America is the center of anger almost as much as the Israelis now. And indeed, if I may just add one thing, I notice, okay, I'm sitting here in Washington now, I can turn on my television when it bothers to cover foreign affairs, and I can see Nick Burns, the State Department, with his little moustache. Then I see Bar Ilan, the Mr. Netanyahu's spokesman, a slightly more elderly man. Okay, so I can tell the difference.
Right.
When I open my newspaper in Beirut and I read what they say, I have to check who's saying it, because what they say is indistinguishable. U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and Israeli foreign policy is exactly the same. They are one and the same thing now. And only the face of the person reminds you who's actually doing the talking. And what's effectively happened is that there is no real attempt, and there's not going to be, by the US government to go back into the middle ground. I mean, when the Palestinians were invited to Washington, they were effectively told, this is what Mr. Netanyahu wants. If they accept it, they're finished. If they reject it, they're going to be blamed for the end of the peace process.
And if the Americans should attack Iran, which many people in this capital think is going to happen?
I think that's Hollywood. They're not going to attack Iran. Absolute rubbish.
Why? We've attacked Libya.
Iran is something quite different.
Lebanon.
Look, oddly enough, your military people talk a lot more sense in private about the Middle East than your political people do. And
but the political people do the ordering.
Yes, but there is no enthusiasm on the part of the military to get involved in that. And if there is an attack on Iran, which I doubt, although the Iranians are concerned about it, of course, the results would be catastrophic, because there would be revenge. I mean, let me go back and tell you this. After the USS Vincennes shot down the Iranian Airbus, and I was in Bandar Abbas looking at the corpses, another mistake.
81, was it?
Not 81, it was much later than that, wasn't it? It was something nearer to 87, 88, wasn't it? It was the end of the Iran-Iraq War we're talking about. Anyway,
okay.
Well, I don't have my files to hand.
Fair enough.
One should get the dates right, but I can't get it all in my brain. After that, I remember in that warehouse in Bandar Abbas, surrounded, I mean, there was a little girl in her wedding clothes. She was going to be a bridesmaid in Kuwait, taken out of the sea, looking if she was just asleep in a coffin. There were other people chopped up in bits. I mean, another massacre. I remember turning to my wife and saying, there's going to be revenge for this. And she said, yes, I fear there is. And I remember I was in Paris on holiday, and turned on the radio and heard that an American aircraft had blown up over Lockerbie. Now, at the moment, we're supposed to believe it was the Libyans. Who knows? But I cannot get out of my mind the thought that there was an element of revenge for the Vincennes.
You were just with Osama bin Laden somewhere. Afghanistan, was it?
Yes, in Afghanistan.
He's apparently one of the Saudi former establishment families, the financier of get the Americans out of Arabia by blowing them up or doing whatever else needs to be done.
I was taken by his armed Arabs who are loyal to him, who fought with him against the Russians, when, of course, they were good guys in your view. 8,000 feet up a mountain to his guerrilla base in the mountain. I spent the night there. I spent hours talking to Osama bin Laden.
Your impressions of him as a person?
Much of the time he spent.
I'm Mark Berzonsky, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.